Nobody ever suspects the 7:15. It is too ordinary, too punctual, too thoroughly unremarkable in every detail that matters to people who measure significance by noise and spectacle. It carries no ambassadors, no heiresses, no secrets worth telling. Or so the world assumes, glancing at it from the platform with the mild, incurious eyes of people who have somewhere to be. The world, as Miss Marple had spent 80-something years quietly demonstrating, was frequently wrong. Evil does not announce itself. It does not arrive on dramatic midnight expresses with mysterious strangers in first class and a body in the dining car. It arrives on the 7:15. It sits across from you with polished shoes and a signet ring and a briefcase held just slightly too tightly. And it checks its watch, and it waits, and it believes, with the serene, terrible confidence of someone who has never been properly looked at, that nobody is watching. Someone is always watching. In this case, she was 79 years old, wore a gray wool coat, carried a pot of blackberry jam for her niece, and had solved more crimes from railway compartments than most inspectors manage in an entire career. She did not look like a reckoning. She looked like furniture, comfortable, forgettable, utterly harmless. This was, of course, precisely the point. What follows is not a story about a missing man, though a man goes missing. It is not a story about fraud, though fraud is at its heart. It is a story about a dead woman's courage, the quiet, invisible, extraordinary kind, passed like a torch between the hands of the people who loved her, carried through the darkness of a November evening on a train that nobody ever suspects. The 7:15 to Little Witchwood, right on time. Chapter 1. The compartment at 7:15. The train had been moving for exactly 4 minutes when Miss Marple decided that something was very wrong indeed. She could not have told you precisely what gave her that feeling. It was not a single thing. It never was. It was the accumulation of small things. The way a knitter notices that a stitch has been dropped, not at the moment it falls, but 3 rows later, when the shape of the whole begins to look subtly, undeniably off. She continued knitting. The pale blue wool moved steadily through her fingers. To any observer, and she was aware always of observers, she was simply a harmless old woman, mildly absorbed in her work, perhaps thinking about whether Florence's baby had grown enough to fit a size 3 cardigan yet. She looked, in short, like furniture. Comfortable, unimportant furniture. This was an advantage she had cultivated over many years, and she used it without the slightest apology. The compartment held 6 people, including herself. Miss Marple had, within the first 90 seconds of boarding, quietly catalogued each of them with the efficient thoroughness of a librarian processing a new delivery of books, assigning each one a mental shelf, a preliminary category, a note of things requiring further examination. Directly across from her sat the man with the briefcase. She had already decided to call him Mr. Anxious, privately, until she learned his real name. He was, she estimated, somewhere between 48 and 53, the sort of age where a man who has made good choices begins to look settled, and a man who has made bad ones begins to look haunted. This man looked haunted. There was a tightness around his jaw that had nothing to do with the temperature, and his eyes, when they were not fixed on the window, moved in small, rapid arcs, checking the door, checking the other passengers, returning always to the briefcase on his lap. He had introduced himself to nobody. He had not even acknowledged the general, unspoken nod of fellowship that English people exchange when confined in small spaces together. He was entirely, aggressively alone inside himself. His right hand rested on the briefcase clasp. The signet ring on his third finger caught the compartment light each time the train swayed, throwing small, nervous sparks. To Miss Marple's left, beside the window, sat a woman of perhaps 65, who had arranged herself with the confident untidiness of someone accustomed to taking up space. She had introduced herself within 30 seconds of Miss Marple's arrival, unsolicited, cheerfully, with the energy of a person who finds silence personally offensive. Mrs. Dolly Hargreaves, she had announced, as though conferring a gift. Widow, Little Witchwood, born and bred. You'll be visiting someone, I expect. You have the look of a visitor. Not that there's anything wrong with that, mind you. My late husband Herbert always said visitors kept a village alive. Herbert was a great believer in fresh perspectives. Of course, he also believed the postman was in love with me, so his judgment was not infallible. She had laughed at this, a large, unself-conscious laugh, and then produced a tin of boiled sweets from her handbag, offered them around to absolutely everyone. Saubin declined by absolutely everyone, and begun sucking one herself with audible satisfaction. Miss Marple had accepted a sweet with a warm smile, and filed Mrs. Dolly Hargreaves under. Talks too much, sees more than she admits. Next to Mrs. Hargreaves, folded into the corner seat with the boneless ease of youth, sat a young man of perhaps 22 or 23. He had the ink-stained fingers of someone who wrote a great deal. Essays, Miss Marple thought, or perhaps letters, and he carried a single canvas bag that sat on the rack above him, with a lightness suggesting it contained almost nothing. He had a one-way ticket. Miss Marple had seen it when he pushed it into his jacket pocket after the conductor passed through. One-way tickets were not remarkable in themselves, but paired with that particular stillness, the absolute, almost studied calm of a young man who ought, by any reasonable expectation, to be reading or fidgeting or staring at his telephone, they became interesting. He was watching, carefully, and pretending, with moderate success, not to be. She filed him under, young, watchful, carrying something heavier than that bag. Across from the young man sat Colonel Ashford. Miss Marple knew a Colonel Ashford type the moment she saw one. 70, perhaps 72. Ramrod posture that had softened only very slightly with age, like a fence post that has been in the ground a long time and earned the right to lean just fractionally. Silver mustache, trimmed with military precision, a copy of the Daily Telegraph open on his knee. He had not turned a page since Miss Marple sat down. She had counted 11 minutes and the same page. The same page while his eyes moved, very slightly, very carefully, above the paper's edge. She filed him under, observing someone, not me, not the young man, the man with the briefcase. The sixth passenger was a woman Miss Marple placed in her mid-30s, though she had the manner of someone considerably older, the compressed, apologetic manner of a person who has spent years trying to occupy as little space as possible. She wore a gray cardigan over a white blouse, no jewelry, no makeup. Her hair was pulled back with the practicality of someone who has stopped considering it a priority. She held a book, a library book, Miss Marple noted, from the plastic covering on its spine, but she was not reading it. She was staring at a point somewhere beyond the words, her fingers working very slightly at the corner of the page. When Mrs. Hargreaves had passed the tin of sweets, this woman had flinched. Actually flinched, just barely, just for a moment, and then smiled a pale, unconvincing smile and shaken her head. A shy person? Possibly. But shyness did not usually produce that particular quality of alertness, the taut, coiled readiness of someone waiting for something they are not certain will be good. Miss Marple filed her under, frightened, and trying very hard not to show why. The train moved through the darkness. Outside, the last pale smear of November light had dissolved entirely from the western horizon. The countryside was invisible now. Only the occasional far-off cluster of farmhouse lights floating past like small, warm promises in the black. Inside the compartment, the heating ticked and murmured. Mrs. Hargreaves sucked her boiled sweet. The young man stared at nothing. The colonel did not turn his page. The man with the briefcase checked his watch again. Miss Marple counted the stitches on her needle, 14, 15, 16, and thought about old Mr. Hawkins of St. Mary Mead, who had once told her that a man who keeps checking a clock is not wondering what time it is. He is counting down to something. She turned her knitting, began the next row, and waited to see what that something would be. Chapter 2. The Man Who Checked His Watch. The train stopped at Nettleford at 7:43. Miss Marple knew this because she had traveled the 7:15 enough times to know its rhythms, the way one knows the rhythms of a familiar piece of music. The small hesitations, the gathering of speed, the particular clatter of the wheels over the junction points just before Nettleford platform. It was a 2-minute stop. Barely enough time for anyone to step off and back on, let alone conduct any meaningful business. And yet, the man with the briefcase stood up. He did it quietly. Too quietly, Miss Marple thought. There is a natural, unconsidered quality to the movements of a person who is simply visiting the lavatory or stretching cramped legs. They push themselves up with mild effort, perhaps mutter an "excuse me" to their neighbors, perhaps knock their knee against the opposite seat and look briefly embarrassed. This man rose with the careful, deliberate smoothness of someone who has rehearsed the movement. He buttoned his jacket. He did not look at anyone. He tucked the briefcase, and here Miss Marple's needles slowed almost imperceptibly, under the seat rather than taking it with him. That was wrong. A man who had not released that briefcase from his lap for the better part of 30 minutes did not simply tuck it under a seat and walk away. Not unless he intended to come back, or not unless he intended very deliberately to make it appear that he intended to come back. "Excuse me," he said, to no one in particular, and stepped out into the corridor. Mrs. Hargreaves watched him go with the mild, proprietary interest of a woman who considers all fellow passengers her personal business. "Lavatory, I expect," she murmured to Miss Marple, companionably, as though they had been friends for years. "Always the way, isn't it, the moment a train stops moving?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and said nothing. The platform at Nettleford was dimly lit and largely empty at this hour. Through the compartment window, Miss Marple could see the station-master's booth, its yellow light falling in a narrow rectangle across the wet platform stones, and beyond it, the darkness of the country night, absolute and indifferent. 2 people got on the train at Nettleford, a heavy-set man in a waxed jacket, who disappeared immediately into the next carriage, a young woman with a pushchair, who struggled briefly with the door before a porter appeared and assisted her. Nobody, as far as Miss Marple could observe, got off, but she had not been watching the far end of the platform. and the far end of the platform, she noted, was very dark indeed. The train moved again at 7:45, precisely on schedule, and the conductor, Mr. Peel, a compact, mustached man of 50, who moved through the carriages with the slightly harassed efficiency of someone perpetually behind on several tasks simultaneously, came through compartment C to check tickets for the second time, which struck Miss Marple as mildly unusual. He had already checked them at St. Mary Mead Junction. She wondered whether he had been asked to check them again, and by whom. But she filed that thought away and presented her ticket with a smile. Mr. Peel took it, clipped it, handed it back, and moved on without making eye contact with anyone, which was either perfectly natural in a busy conductor or the behavior of a man with something specific on his mind. Miss Marple rather thought the latter. 7 minutes passed. Mrs. Hargreaves had progressed from boiled sweets to a small packet of shortbread, and was offering those around with equal lack of success. Young Thomas, Miss Marple had by now overheard his name, Thomas Birch, from a brief and slightly terse telephone call he had made at Nettleford, saying only, "I'm on the train, I'll be there when I'm there," before hanging up, had finally opened his canvas bag and produced a notebook, into which he was writing with the concentrated energy of someone transcribing thoughts before they escaped. Colonel Ashford had at last turned his newspaper page, but he had done it with a small, controlled movement that suggested it was a decision rather than an absent habit, and his eyes, Miss Marple noticed, now moved differently, less watchful, more settled, as though something he had been waiting to see had either happened or definitively not happened, and he had adjusted accordingly. The mousy woman, Miss Marple still did not know her name, had closed her library book entirely. She sat with it in her lap, her hands folded over the cover with a stillness that was not peaceful. It was the stillness of someone exerting considerable conscious effort not to look at the space under the seat across the aisle, where the briefcase sat. It was Mrs. Hargreaves who noticed first, in the loudly innocent way that people who have been paying close attention sometimes deploy to disguise the fact that they have been paying close attention. "I say," she said, looking around with exaggerated vagueness, "has our quiet friend not come back yet?" The gentleman who went to the... She gestured delicately toward the corridor. "It's been rather a while, hasn't it?" Nobody answered her immediately. Thomas Birch looked up from his notebook. Colonel Ashford lowered his newspaper by precisely 2 inches. The mousy woman's hands tightened on her book. Miss Marple counted her stitches. 17, 18, 19. "It has been a little while," she agreed mildly. Another 4 minutes passed. The train was now 12 minutes out of Nettleford, running through the deep country dark with the steady, indifferent confidence of something that has a destination and will reach it regardless of what its passengers do or do not do. Mr. Peel came back through the corridor at 8:02, and this time Miss Marple caught his eye quite deliberately, the way one catches the eye of a person one wishes to engage, not aggressively, but with the quiet, unmistakable intention of a woman who has a question and does not intend to be overlooked. He stopped. "Everything all right, madam?" "Perfectly, thank you," said Miss Marple. "I wondered only, the gentleman who was sitting here," she indicated the empty seat, the tucked briefcase, the space where a nervous man and his trembling hands had been. "Has he perhaps found another compartment? I only ask because he left his case." Mr. Peel looked at the empty seat, then at the briefcase, then back at Miss Marple, with an expression that moved, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, from mild professional concern to something considerably less mild. He went to the lavatory, Mr. Peel said, at Nettleford's stop. Yes, said Miss Marple. That was 17 minutes ago. The silence that followed was of a different quality, entirely from the silence that had preceded it. It was the silence of a compartment full of people, simultaneously realizing that something had shifted, that the evening, which had been an ordinary evening, had quietly and irrevocably stopped being one. Mr. Peel excused himself with brisk, unconvincing calm, and disappeared toward the front of the train. Miss Marple looked at the briefcase under the seat. She looked at the empty space where a man called Mr. Anxious had sat for 31 minutes, checking his watch, trembling slightly, protecting that case with the vigilance of someone guarding something irreplaceable, and had then left it behind and walked away. And she looked, finally, at the seat itself, where something small and white lay half-tucked against the upholstered back cushion, as though it had slipped there unnoticed. A glove, a single, white, left-handed glove. Miss Marple set down her knitting very gently, folded her hands in her lap, and gazed at the dark window with the serene, faraway expression of a woman who has just understood something important. Outside, the countryside rushed past, cold and black and absolute. The 7:15 to Little Witchwood ran on through the dark, and somewhere between Nettleford and the world, a man had ceased to exist. Chapter 3. The Glove and the Silence. The train pulled into Little Witchwood at 8:19. It was 4 minutes late, which was, for the 7:15, practically punctual. The platform was small and poorly lit, 2 iron lamp posts throwing amber circles onto wet stone, a wooden bench with peeling green paint, a station master's office whose single window glowed with the particular warmth of a room containing a kettle, and a man who would rather be home. Miss Marple did not move immediately when the train stopped. This was not unusual for her. She had long ago abandoned the undignified scramble that overtook otherwise sensible people the moment a train reached its destination, the sudden lunging for overhead racks, the aggressive jostling in narrow corridors, the peculiar collective amnesia about basic courtesy that seemed to afflict entire carriages simultaneously. She preferred to wait, to let the rush subside, to observe in those final, unhurried moments what people did when they thought the performance was over. What people did tonight was interesting. Mrs. Hargreaves rose immediately and with considerable energy, collecting her handbag, her tin of boiled sweets, and her coat with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has been getting off trains at Little Witchwood for 40 years. But she did not leave. She hovered near the compartment door, fussing with her coat buttons with slightly more attention than coat buttons generally require, her eyes moving, just once, quickly, to the briefcase still sitting under the empty seat. Thomas Birch closed his notebook, capped his pen, and stood. He hoisted his canvas bag onto his shoulder with the unhurried ease of someone who has decided, quite deliberately, not to appear hurried. He glanced at Miss Marple, not at the briefcase, not at the empty seat. At Miss Marple, just for a moment. Then he looked away and moved toward the door. Colonel Ashford folded his newspaper with military precision, corners exactly aligned, creases sharp, and tucked it under his arm. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked once directly at the space where the man with the briefcase had been sitting. It was a look of assessment rather than curiosity. The look of a man checking whether a thing he had anticipated had in fact occurred. The mousy woman, whose name Miss Marple still did not know, had not moved at all. She sat with her library book in her lap and her eyes on the floor, and there was something in her absolute stillness that reminded Miss Marple, with unexpected vividness, of a rabbit she had once seen in her garden, frozen in the shadow of a passing hawk. Not hiding, exactly. Simply waiting to know whether the danger had passed. It had not, Miss Marple thought. Not by a considerable distance. Mr. Peel appeared in the compartment doorway before anyone had fully departed. He had, in the 19 minutes since he had left to investigate, acquired a somewhat altered expression. He had left wearing the face of a man dealing with a minor administrative inconvenience. He had returned wearing the face of a man who has looked into a lavatory, checked 3 other compartments, walked the length of the train twice, and found nothing, and who has now arrived at the deeply uncomfortable conclusion that nothing is, in this case, the problem. "I must ask you all to remain in the compartment for a few moments," he said. His voice was admirably steady. "There is a small matter requiring attention before you disembark. I've sent word to the station master." Mrs. Hargreaves stopped pretending to button her coat. "Is this about the gentleman who didn't come back?" she asked, with the directness of someone who has been waiting to ask this question for 20 minutes and considers patience to have its limits. Mr. Peel looked at her with the expression of a man who would very much prefer not to confirm or deny anything. "If you could just bear with me, Mrs. Hargreaves, Dolly Hargreaves. I've been taking this train since 1987, and I've never been asked to remain in a compartment in my life." She sat back down, nonetheless, with the decisive air of someone choosing to cooperate, while making absolutely certain everyone understood it was a choice. The station master, Mr. Briggs. "I arrived on the platform at 8:24. He was a large, unhurried man, with the resigned competence of someone who has managed small crises for so long that they have ceased to feel like crises, merely like weather. Unpredictable, occasionally inconvenient, ultimately survivable. He spoke briefly with Mr. Peel on the platform, their voices inaudible through the glass, but their postures, Mr. Peel increasingly tense, Mr. Briggs increasingly serious, readable enough. Then Mr. Briggs disappeared back into his office and made a telephone call. Miss Marple, who had by now gathered her knitting bag, her handbag, and her pot of blackberry jam, and arranged herself with the patient composure of a woman prepared to wait as long as necessary, watched all of this, and thought about a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Elvira Cottage, who had once reported her husband missing on a Tuesday evening, only for him to reappear on Wednesday morning with no explanation beyond a vague reference to having lost track of time. The interesting thing about that particular case had not been the husband's absence. It had been the 12-hour interval between his disappearance and his wife's report of it, and what that interval suggested about what Mrs. Cottage had, in fact, been doing during those 12 hours. Intervals, Miss Marple had always believed, were where the truth lived, and Inspector Garvey arrived at 8:51. He came in a police car that pulled up outside the station with slightly more urgency than the situation, as yet officially understood, strictly warranted. This told Miss Marple something about what Mr. Briggs had said on the telephone. He had not said merely that a passenger had failed to return from the lavatory. He had said something that made a policeman drive quickly on a cold November night. Inspector Garvey was perhaps 45, with the broad, solid build of a man who had played rugby in his youth and had since transferred that same energy into his professional life. Straightforward, direct, slightly impatient with complexity, and possessed of the particular brand of confidence that comes from being, more often than not, the largest and loudest person in any given room. He was not, Miss Marple thought with the gentle private clarity of long experience, going to find this case straightforward. He entered compartment C, looked at the 5 remaining passengers, looked at the empty seat, looked at the briefcase, and looked finally at the single white glove that Miss Marple had left precisely where she had found it, tucked against the back cushion, undisturbed, waiting to be properly noticed. "Right," he said, with the decisive energy of a man establishing authority. "Which of you touched that glove?" Silence. "Nobody," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I noticed it, Inspector, but I thought it best to leave it where it was. Evidence, I always think, is so much more useful in its original position." Inspector Garvey looked at her. It was the particular look. Miss Marple recognized it immediately, having received variations of it from a considerable number of inspectors over the years, of a man recalibrating his understanding of who in the room was likely to be the most trouble. "And you are?" he said. "Miss Marple," she said, "Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead." She smiled. "I'm visiting my niece. I've brought jam." Inspector Garvey looked at the knitting bag, at the brown paper parcel, at the pale blue cardigan folded neatly on top. Then he looked back at the white glove on the empty seat, and at the locked briefcase beneath it, and at the dark window beyond which a man had simply ceased to exist, somewhere between one station and the next. He took out his notebook. "Right," he said again. But this time, Miss Marple noticed, with rather less certainty. Chapter 4. 6 Strangers and 1 Truth. Inspector Garvey had a method. Miss Marple had observed enough policemen over enough years to recognize the various species of investigative method, the way a naturalist recognizes birds, not just by their obvious markings, but by their movement, their habits, the particular way they occupied space. There were the meticulous ones, who wrote everything down in small, precise handwriting, and trusted nothing they had not personally verified. There were the intuitive ones, who moved on instinct and were occasionally brilliant and more frequently wrong. There were the political ones, who solved cases primarily in the direction of least professional inconvenience. Inspector Garvey, she decided within 4 minutes of his arrival, was the forthright variety. He believed in momentum, in asking questions loudly and directly, and watching what people did when they felt cornered. It was not a bad method. It worked, she imagined, rather well on people who had done straightforward things for straightforward reasons. It was going to be nearly useless tonight. He started with Mrs. Hargreaves, which was either instinct or alphabetical order, and Miss Marple suspected the latter. "Mrs. Hargreaves, you were seated next to the window, opposite the missing gentleman. Did you speak to him at any point during the journey?" "I offered him a boiled sweet," said Mrs. Hargreaves promptly. "He declined. Very politely, mind you. He said, 'No, thank you,' which is more than can be said for some people." She directed this last observation toward Thomas Birch with the mild reproach of someone who has not forgotten a social slight, however minor. Beyond that, no. He wasn't what you'd call a conversational traveler. Did you notice anything unusual about him? His behavior, his manner? Mrs. Hargreaves considered this with the thoughtful expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked precisely this question, and has prepared accordingly. He was nervous, she said, dreadfully nervous, kept checking his watch, and he held on to that briefcase as though it contained the crown jewels or something equally impractical. She paused. I did think it odd that he left it behind when he went out. A man that attached to a case doesn't just leave it under a seat. Inspector Garvey wrote this down. Did you see him leave the compartment? I did. At Nettleford stop. He stood up, said, "Excuse me," to nobody in particular, and went out into the corridor. Did you see which direction he went? A very brief hesitation. So brief that Miss Marple thought she might have imagined it, except that she had not. Toward the front of the train, I believe. The lavatory is that direction. You believe? I wasn't watching him go, said Mrs. Hargreaves with the mild indignation of a woman accused of nosiness. I was attending to my shortbread. Thomas Birch, when his turn came, answered with the economical precision of someone who has decided in advance exactly how much to say, and intends to say precisely that amount, and nothing further. Yes, he had been in the compartment for the full journey. No, he had not spoken to the missing man. Yes, he had noticed he was nervous. It would have been difficult not to. No, he had not seen which direction he went when he left, because he had been writing in his notebook and not paying attention to the corridor. One-way ticket, said Inspector Garvey, looking at his notes. Where are you headed, Mr. Birch? Little Witchwood. Permanently? A pause. For the foreseeable future. Visiting someone? That's a personal matter. Inspector. Inspector Garvey looked up from his notebook with the expression of a man unused to being told what is and is not his business. In a missing persons investigation, Mr. Birch, very little is a personal matter. Thomas Birch met his gaze with a steadiness that struck Miss Marple as interesting. Not defiance exactly, not guilt exactly. Something more considered than either. I'm going to stay with my uncle, he said after a moment. He's been unwell. Inspector Garvey wrote this down with the slight dissatisfaction of a man who has pushed on a door and found it open, only to discover a perfectly ordinary room behind it. Colonel Ashford was crisp, cooperative, and almost entirely uninformative. He had been reading his newspaper. He had noticed the missing gentleman in the vague, peripheral way one notices fellow passengers. Present, unremarkable, not his concern. He had not spoken to him. He had not seen him leave. He had not noticed the glove. He had not noticed the briefcase particularly. He was very sorry not to be more helpful, but he was afraid he had very little to offer. He delivered all of this with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who has spent decades in situations requiring careful management of what he reveals and what he does not, and Miss Marple found herself thinking of a phrase her father had once used. The most dangerous testimony is the testimony that is perfectly, seamlessly, entirely consistent. Real memory was never perfectly consistent. It stumbled. It contradicted itself in small ways. It offered unnecessary details alongside glaring gaps. Colonel Ashford's account was too clean, too contained, like a room that has been tidied very recently and very thoroughly. She filed this observation carefully and returned to her knitting. The mousy woman's name, Miss Marple finally learned, was Edith Crowe. She gave it quietly, in the manner of someone who would prefer not to give it at all, but recognizes that refusing would be considerably worse. She was, she said, a librarian. She worked at the Little Witchwood Public Library and had been in the city for a staff training day. She was returning home. She had a return, she caught herself, a single ticket, because she had not been certain of the return time when she booked. The correction was small, barely noticeable. Inspector Garvey did not notice it. Miss Marple did. A person who has a return ticket does not need to be uncertain of the return time. A return ticket is precisely the thing one buys when one does not know what time one will be coming back. But Edith Crowe had begun to say return, stopped herself, and said single, and the correction had come just a fraction too late, with just a fraction too much control to be entirely natural. She'd been watching the briefcase all evening. She flinched when it was mentioned, and now she had quietly, almost invisibly, altered her account of her own ticket. Miss Marple looked at Edith Crowe's hands, folded in her lap over the library book. The knuckles were very slightly white. She was not, Miss Marple thought with a kind of gentle, sorrowful clarity, a bad person. There was nothing in her face that suggested malice or cruelty. What was there, visible, if one knew how to look, was the particular, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and has recently decided, with a kind of desperate courage, to put it down. Whatever she had done at Nettleford Station, or been part of, or witnessed, she had not done it lightly, and she had not done it for herself. Inspector Garvey concluded his initial interviews at 9:22, closed his notebook with the decisive snap of a man who has gathered information and is now prepared to act on it, and announced that the station storeroom and surrounding platform area at Nettleford would be searched immediately, that all passengers were free to leave their details with the constable on the platform, but should remain available for further questioning, and that the briefcase would be taken into evidence. He reached under the seat for it as he said this. The clasps Miss Marple had noticed earlier were scratched around the keyhole in the particular way that suggests someone has attempted, with moderate skill and limited tools, to open a lock that does not belong to them. She said nothing about this yet. There was a time for everything, and the time for that particular observation was not, she had decided, 9:22, on a cold platform in Little Witchwood, with a man who moved on momentum and had not yet slowed down enough to think. She gathered her knitting bag, her handbag, and her pot of blackberry jam. She gave her name and her niece's address to the young constable at the platform door, who wrote it down with the careful, slightly self-conscious penmanship of someone aware they are writing down the details of a very old lady, and hoping this will not turn out to be significant. It would, of course, turn out to be very significant indeed. Miss Marple stepped out onto the platform, breathed the cold November air, and looked up at the sky, dense with cloud, not a star visible, the darkness complete and total. Somewhere in that darkness, she thought, between one station and the next, the truth was sitting very quietly, waiting to be found. She was rather looking forward to finding it. Chapter 5. What the Knitting Knows, Florence Atterley, née Marple, though she had been Atterley for 11 years now, and wore the name with the comfortable ease of a well-fitted coat, was the sort of young woman who worried about the right things in the wrong order. She worried enormously about whether her baby, Edmund, was getting enough iron in his diet. She worried rather less about whether the garden gate had been properly latched, which was why the postman had twice this month retrieved Edmund from the front path. She worried about global affairs, climate, the state of modern education, and whether her Victoria sponge was as good as her mother's had been. She did not, as a rule, worry about her great-aunt Jane. This was partly because Miss Marple had always seemed, to Florence's eyes, essentially indestructible, the kind of person who would outlast not just her contemporaries, but several generations of their descendants, still knitting, still noticing things, still making quietly devastating observations about human nature over cups of tea. And partly because worrying about Miss Marple felt instinctively like the wrong direction entirely. Miss Marple was not the sort of person things happened to. She was the sort of person who happened to things. Nevertheless, when her great-aunt arrived at the cottage door at 9:47, nearly 90 minutes later than expected, accompanied by a young constable, who waited on the path while Miss Marple came inside, as though making certain she arrived safely, Florence felt a small, cold finger of unease press briefly against her sternum. "Aunt Jane," she said, "you're terribly late." I was beginning to think. "I brought the jam," said Miss Marple, producing the brown paper parcel from her knitting bag, with the satisfaction of a woman who has successfully transported something fragile through considerable turbulence. "Blackberry. Ptolemy nearly had it, but I was quicker." Florence took the jam. She looked at the constable on the path, who gave her a brief, professionally neutral nod, and then retreated toward a police car parked at the lane's end. She looked back at her great-aunt. What on earth has happened? Miss Marple settled into the armchair beside Florence's fireplace, a good fire, well-banked, the room warm and lamp-lit and smelling of the particular domestic combination of baby powder and baking that Miss Marple found deeply, unreasonably comforting, and accepted a cup of tea with both hands, warming her fingers around the cup for a moment before drinking. She told Florence the broad outline of it. A man missing from the train, a briefcase left behind, a single white glove, Inspector Garvey and his notebook. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she always told things, just the facts, arranged in their proper order, which was itself a kind of story. Florence listened with the wide, slightly horrified attention of a sensible person encountering the genuinely strange. "But where did he go?" she said, when Miss Marple finished. "He can't simply have vanished." "No," agreed Miss Marple. "People don't vanish. They go somewhere, or they are put somewhere, or they arrange to appear to have gone somewhere when in fact they have done something else entirely." She sipped her tea. "In this case, I suspect a combination of the second and third." "You already know what happened?" "I have a very strong idea," said Miss Marple, with the mild, unassuming certainty that Florence had learned over many years and was more reliable than most people's absolute conviction. Whether I can demonstrate it to Inspector Garvey's satisfaction is rather a different matter. Inspectors require evidence. They are not always patient with intuition, however well-founded. Florence looked at her great-aunt's face, calm, thoughtful, the pale blue eyes moving with quiet purpose behind their glasses, and felt that cold finger of unease press against her sternum again. Not for her aunt this time, for whoever, she thought, was on the receiving end of those pale blue eyes. Miss Marple slept well that night, which was something Florence found faintly unsettling in the circumstances, though she could not have said precisely why. She was up at 6:45, dressed and at the kitchen table with her second cup of tea, before Florence had come downstairs, and she had, at some point in the night or the early morning, produced 3 pages of very small, very neat handwriting on the notepad Florence kept by the telephone for shopping lists. Florence, arriving in her dressing gown with Edmund on her hip, looked at the notepad and then at her aunt. "Have you been up all night?" "Certainly not," said Miss Marple. "I slept perfectly. I simply woke early and found it useful to organize my thoughts." She tapped the notepad. "I find that writing things down clarifies them considerably. The act of forming a word on paper forces one to commit to it. You see, one can hedge indefinitely in one's head, but on paper, a thing is either there or it is not." Florence sat down, settled Edmund with a rusk, and looked at the notepad properly. The writing was small but legible, a series of names, observations, questions, and what appeared to be a small diagram of a railway platform. "Mrs. Dolly Hargreaves," Florence read aloud, slowly. "Knows his name before it was given. Brooch initials wrong. Watching the door, not the case." She looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," said Miss Marple, "that Mrs. Hargreaves is not quite what she presents herself as. She is very good at being Dolly Hargreaves. Warm, chatty, slightly overbearing, absolutely unthreatening. She has been doing it for so long that it has become entirely natural. But there are small fissures. There always are." She had thought, lying in Florence's comfortable spare bedroom, with the curtains open, and the November sky gradually lightening from black to the particular deep gray of an English winter dawn, about each of the 5 passengers in turn. Mrs. Hargreaves, who knew too much too soon, and whose brooch carried someone else's initials. E.F., not D.H. She had thought about that brooch for a considerable time. Thomas Birch, who was calm when calmness was strange, who watched without appearing to watch, and whose telephone call at Nettleford, "I'll be there when I'm there," had the flattened affect of someone delivering a prearranged message rather than genuinely reassuring a worried relative. Colonel Ashford, whose testimony was too neat, too complete, too devoid of the natural inconsistencies of genuine memory. A man who had spent the journey watching the man with the briefcase and claimed not to have noticed him. Edith Crowe, who had corrected herself on the matter of her ticket, whose hands had been white at the knuckles, who flinched at the briefcase, who had, and this Miss Marple returned to repeatedly, examining it from different angles like a stone that might be precious, carried a library book she never read, to a city she did not appear to have visited for any library-related purpose. On a training day she had not mentioned to Inspector Garvey until he asked directly where she had been. And Mr. Peel, the conductor, whose logbook, as she had caught a glimpse of when he consulted it on the platform, showed an 11-minute gap between his 7:31 entry and his 7:42 entry. 11 minutes in which he had, apparently, done nothing recordable. On a 3-carriage train. "Aunt Jane," said Florence carefully, watching her great-aunt's face, "do you know who did it?" "I know who was involved," said Miss Marple, "and I know what was done. What I do not yet know," she paused, turning her teacup in both hands, "is the precise sequence, the order in which things happened. And that matters enormously, because it is the difference between several quite different stories, only one of which is true." She looked out of Florence's kitchen window at the gray November morning. A robin sat on the garden fence, very red against the white frost on the grass, regarding the world with the bright, unsentimental attention of a small creature that cannot afford to miss anything. "Rather like me," thought Miss Marple, with a small, private smile. "I think," she said, setting down her cup, "that I shall need to speak with Mrs. Hargreaves this morning, and with Edith Crowe." She paused. "Separately. and I think I shall need to do it before Inspector Garvey does." Florence stared at her. "Why before?" "Because," said Miss Marple, standing and smoothing her gray wool coat with the decisive composure of a woman who has made up her mind, "Inspector Garvey will ask them what they did, or I intend to ask them why." She picked up her knitting bag. "There is an enormous difference," she said, "between the two." Chapter 6. Tea, Shortbread, and Small Devastations. Mrs. Dolly Hargreaves lived in a cottage on Witchwood Lane that announced itself cheerfully from 50 yards away. Window boxes still holding the skeletal remains of summer geraniums, a brass door knocker in the shape of a fox, a doormat reading "Welcome" in letters so emphatic they felt slightly aggressive. Miss Marple arrived at 9:10, having walked the lane at a pace her doctor would have approved of, and her pride would never have admitted to being her actual best speed. The morning was cold and bright, the frost still holding in the shadowed places beneath hedges, the sky a pale, washed blue that promised nothing in particular. She knocked. Mrs. Hargreaves answered so promptly that she had either been expecting someone or had been standing very close to the door. Miss Marple suspected both. Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves's smile was warm, immediate, and, just fractionally, too composed for a woman receiving an unannounced visit from a fellow passenger in what was now, officially, a police matter. "How lovely! I was just putting the kettle on. Come in, come in." The cottage interior matched its exterior, full, colorful, slightly overwhelming, every surface occupied by something that had either sentimental value or the appearance of it. Photographs on the mantelpiece, a collection of ceramic dogs along the windowsill, fresh flowers in a blue jug on the kitchen table, which struck Miss Marple as notable. Fresh flowers in November required either a heated greenhouse or a visit to the florist, and the little Witchwood florist did not open until 9:30. These flowers had been here before 9:30. Someone had brought them yesterday, or last night. Miss Marple sat in the chair indicated, accepted tea and a plate of shortbread, the same shortbread from last night, she noted, or its twin, and arranged her face into the pleasant, unfocused expression of a woman enjoying a neighborly morning visit. "Dreadful business last night," said Mrs. Hargreaves, settling opposite her with the brisk comfort of a woman on familiar territory. "I barely slept." "Have you heard anything from the police? Do they know where the poor man got to?" "Not as far as I know," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Inspector Garvey seemed very capable. I'm sure he'll get to the bottom of it. I'm sure he will." A brief pause. Comfortable on the surface, something else underneath. Shocking thing, a man just disappearing like that, on an ordinary Tuesday evening. "It was a Thursday," said Miss Marple. The pause this time was different, fractionally longer, fractionally more considered. "Was it? Good heavens! I lose track completely this time of year." Mrs. Hargreaves laughed, that large, natural laugh. "The days all blur together once the clocks go back, don't they?" They did, sometimes. But Mrs. Hargreaves had mentioned on the train that she took the 7:15 every Thursday to visit her sister in Nettleford. She knew perfectly well what day it was. She had simply, for one unguarded half-second, not been thinking about the cover story. She had been thinking about something else. Miss Marple ate a piece of shortbread and said nothing. Silence, she had always found, was a more effective tool than most people gave it credit for. "That brooch is lovely," said Miss Marple eventually, nodding toward the small pearl and enamel brooch at Mrs. Hargreaves' collar, the same one she had worn on the train. Is it a family piece?" Something moved behind Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes. Very quick, very controlled. "It was my mother's," she said. "How nice," said Miss Marple. "The initials are so elegant. E.F. What a pretty engraving." The silence that followed was of a quality Miss Marple recognized well. It was the silence of a person standing at a fork in a road, understanding with sudden, cold clarity that both paths are visible to the person watching, and that pretending otherwise is no longer a viable option. Mrs. Hargreaves set down her teacup. When she looked up, the warmth in her face had not disappeared. It was too deeply habitual for that, but something beneath it had shifted, like a stage flat swinging on its hinge, revealing the plain wooden structure behind the painted surface. "You are not," she said quietly, "simply a little old lady with a pot of jam. I am absolutely a little old lady with a pot of jam," said Miss Marple, with perfect sincerity. "I am also someone who has lived a long time and paid a great deal of attention. The two things are not mutually exclusive." She folded her hands in her lap. "The brooch belonged to Eleanor Foss, didn't it?" "The wife of Reginald Foss." Mrs. Hargreaves was very still. "You knew him," said Miss Marple. Not an accusation, simply a statement of a thing that was now, between the two of them, established. Or rather, you knew her. It came out slowly, the way things do when a person has been holding them for a long time, and finally, in the presence of someone who already knows the essential shape of it, allows the rest to follow. Eleanor Foss had been Mrs. Hargreaves's closest friend for 30 years. They had grown up 3 streets apart in Little Witchwood. They had been bridesmaids at each other's weddings. When Eleanor's husband, the respectable, well-dressed, perpetually nervous Reginald Foss, had begun, 3 years ago, to systematically drain the estate left to Eleanor by her father, Eleanor had told nobody but Dolly. And when Eleanor had died 8 months ago, heart failure, the doctors said, though Mrs. Hargreaves' voice carried in those 3 words the particular weight of a woman who believed the cause ran deeper than any doctor had recorded. She had left Dolly the brooch. And a letter. The letter, Mrs. Hargreaves said, had contained names, dates, account numbers. The careful, frightened documentation of a woman who had known she was running out of time and had wanted, very much, for someone to know the truth after she was gone. "So you watched him," said Miss Marple gently. "I watched him." Mrs. Hargreaves looked at the brooch at her collar. Her fingers touched it briefly, not fussing, just resting there, the way one touches something that connects to someone no longer present. "I found out when he traveled. I made sure I was on the same trains. I needed to understand what he was doing, where he was going, whether he was planning to run. And last night you understood," said Miss Marple, "that he was." Mrs. Hargreaves looked at her steadily. "Last night I understood that if I didn't do something, he would be gone before morning." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Outside the cottage window, the November morning continued its pale, unhurried business. A wood pigeon somewhere in the bare elm tree. The distant sound of the little Witchwood church clock, marking the half-hour with patient, indifferent strokes. "You weren't alone in this, were you?" said Miss Marple. Mrs. Hargreaves looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, she shook her head. Chapter 7. The Librarian's Burden. The Little Witchwood Public Library opened at 10 o'clock. Miss Marple arrived at 5 past, which was deliberate. She had learned long ago that arriving precisely at opening time carried a faint suggestion of urgency, of need, which put people on their guard. 5 minutes past was different. 5 minutes past said I happened to be passing. I had no particular plan. I am simply here. The library was a small stone building on the far end of the high street, squeezed between a hardware shop and a tea room with a hand-lettered sign in its window, advertising cream teas at prices and that suggested the proprietor had not updated them since approximately 1987. The library's door had a brass handle, polished to a warmth that suggested habitual, affectionate use. Someone loved this building. Miss Marple went in. Edith Crowe was behind the returns desk, processing a small stack of books with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who finds genuine comfort in the orderly movement of familiar tasks. She was wearing the same gray cardigan as the night before, or one so similar as to make no practical difference, and her hair was pulled back with the same utilitarian neatness. She looked up when Miss Marple entered. The expression that crossed her face was not surprise. It was something more complicated, a kind of resigned recognition, the look of a person who has been half expecting a particular conversation and has spent the intervening hours neither dreading it nor welcoming it, simply waiting for it to arrive. "Miss Marple," she said quietly. "Good morning, dear," said Miss Marple with the warm, unhurried ease of a woman who has come to return a book. She approached the desk, set her knitting bag down on the counter, and looked at Edith Crowe with the gentle, attentive directness that she reserved for people she had already decided deserved honesty rather than maneuver. "I thought you might come," said Edith. "I thought you might think so," said Miss Marple. "Shall I tell you what I know, and you can tell me what I've missed? I find that saves a great deal of time on both sides." Edith looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded. Miss Marple knew this. Edith Crowe was Eleanor Foss's daughter from her first marriage, before Eleanor became a Foss at all. She had taken her father's name after the divorce, which was why nothing about her connected, on the surface, to the Foss estate, to Reginald Foss, to any of it. She was simply Edith Crowe, a librarian, quiet, unremarkable, living 3 miles from her mother's second husband and watching, for 3 years, while he dismantled everything her mother had. She had known about the embezzlement before Eleanor died. Eleanor had told her, ace toward the end, had pressed into her hands a copy of the same documentation she had given Dolly Hargreaves, the names and dates and account numbers that represented 3 years of systematic theft conducted with the patient, meticulous confidence of a man who believed himself entirely safe. "She didn't go to the police herself?" Miss Marple asked. Edith's mouth pressed into a thin, careful line. "She tried. Once, early on," she paused. "Reginald found out. After that, She stopped, started again. She was afraid. She stayed afraid until the end. Miss Marple was quiet. She understood, with the deep, untheoretical understanding of a woman who had known many Eleanors over many years, exactly what that sentence contained and what it had cost to say it plainly. After Eleanor died, Edith had contacted Dolly Hargreaves. Not immediately. Grief had its own timeline, and so did courage. But 6 months after the funeral, she had knocked on the cottage door on Witchwood Lane, and Dolly had opened it, and they had sat at the same kitchen table where Miss Marple had sat this morning, and they had looked at the documents together, and they had understood that if something was going to be done, they would have to do it themselves. They had been watching Reginald Foss for 2 months when they realized he was preparing to leave. Small signs, individually meaningless. A storage unit rented in a name that was not his. your 2 unexplained withdrawals from an account linked to the estate, a passport application, Dolly had a friend at the post office, the way that women of a certain age in small villages always seem to have a friend at the relevant place, filed 3 weeks ago. He was going to run. The only question was when. The answer, it turned out, was the 14th of November. The 7:15 to Little Witchwood, and then not to Little Witchwood at all. "You knew he'd be on that train," said Miss Marple. "We knew," said Edith, "and you had a plan." Edith looked down at the book in her hands, a worn hardback, someone's well-loved copy of something, the spine creased with repeated reading. She turned it over once, then set it down. "We had a plan," she said. "It didn't go quite the way we intended." Miss Marple waited. "He panicked," Edith said, "on the platform at Nettleford. I followed him off the train. I was going to confront him, give him the chance to return the documents voluntarily, to contact the solicitors himself before we went to the police. I thought—" She paused. "I thought perhaps if he understood that it was already over, he might choose to do the right thing. But he didn't. He ran, and then he slipped." She said it simply, without drama, the way one states a fact that has been turned over so many times it is worn smooth. The platform steps were wet. He went down hard. He wasn't seriously hurt. But he was unconscious. "And you put him in the storeroom," said Miss Marple. "I couldn't leave him on the platform," said Edith quietly. "And I didn't want him to simply disappear into the night when he came round. So I telephoned the police from the platform box, anonymously, and I got back on the train." The library was very quiet around them. The particular quality of silence that libraries cultivate, not empty, but held, as though the books themselves were listening. Miss Marple looked at Edith Crowe, at the exhaustion in her face, the stubborn, fragile dignity of a woman who had done a frightening thing for a true reason, and was now waiting, with the patience of someone who has already survived the worst, to learn what it would cost her. "You did it for your mother," said Miss Marple. Edith did not answer. She did not need to. Chapter 8. Inspector Garvey's Education. Inspector Garvey was not by nature a man who enjoyed being wrong. This was not, in itself, an unusual quality. Most people did not enjoy being wrong, but there was a particular species of not enjoying being wrong that was specific to men of Inspector Garvey's professional disposition, men who had built their competence, their reputation, and a significant portion of their self-understanding on the premise that they were reliably right. For such men, the experience of wrongness was not merely unpleasant. It was faintly destabilizing, like finding a step in a familiar staircase that has, without warning, become 2 inches shorter than expected. Miss Marple had destabilized a considerable number of such men over the years. She had always found it more productive to do so gently. She had telephoned Inspector Garvey from Florence's cottage at 11:30, having returned from the library at 11, drunk another cup of tea, fed Edmund a rusk. He accepted it with the grave, a considering expression of a person evaluating a business proposal, and written 3 additional pages of small, neat notes on Florence's telephone pad. Inspector Garvey had answered on the 2nd ring, which told her he was at his desk and not in the field, which meant he had not yet found Reginald Foss in the Nettleford storeroom, or he had found him and was processing the paperwork, which was almost the same thing in terms of where the investigation currently stood. "Miss Marple," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who has decided overnight to keep an open mind about elderly ladies with knitting bags. "I was going to telephone you this morning." "How kind," said Miss Marple. "I wondered whether you might be free to meet this afternoon. I have some information that I believe would be useful to your investigation." A pause. "What sort of information?" "The sort," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "that explains where Mr. Foss went, why he went there, who followed him, and what was in the briefcase." She paused. "And also, I think, the sort that will require you to approach the matter with rather more delicacy than a standard missing persons case would suggest." Another pause. Longer. She could almost hear him recalibrating. 3:00, he said. "Little Witchwood Station Cafe. They do a reasonable tea." "Lovely," said Miss Marple. "I'll bring biscuits." The station cafe was small and warm, and smelled of strong tea and the particular institutional fruit cake that appears, Miss Marple had always thought, to be manufactured in some central facility and distributed to every railway cafe in England simultaneously, in infinite supply. 4 tables with red checked cloths. A counter with a formidable woman behind it, who moved with the brisk authority of someone who has been making tea for 30 years and has no patience with people who want it weak. Miss Marple arrived at 5 to 3. Inspector Garvey arrived at 3 exactly, which she noted as a point in his favor. A man who arrives precisely on time is a man who can be worked with. He sat down, declined the fruitcake, accepted the tea, and looked at Miss Marple with the expression of a professional who has decided to listen before speaking, which was, she thought, a considerable improvement on last night. "They found Foss," he said, before she could begin. "Nettleford Station storeroom this morning, 7:43. He was conscious, unharmed beyond a bruised shoulder, and a fairly significant injury to his dignity. He's been taken to Nettleford police station." He paused. "He's saying he was attacked, that someone pushed him on the platform steps and locked him in." "He slipped," said Miss Marple calmly. "The platform steps were wet. There was no attack." Inspector Garvey looked at her. "You know this how?" "Because the person who was with him on that platform is not the sort of person who pushes," said Miss Marple. "She is the sort of person who follows and confronts, and, when things go unexpectedly wrong, makes the most sensible decision available to her under the circumstances." She folded her hands on the table. She also telephoned to the police, anonymously, which is not, Inspector, the action of someone who has committed a crime. It is the action of someone who has found themselves in an unexpected situation and has tried, imperfectly, to do the right thing. She told him everything then. Not all at once. She was careful about the order, because the order mattered. She began with Eleanor Foss, because Eleanor was the reason for all of it, and a case that begins in the middle, without its proper foundation, is a case that inspectors tend to misunderstand in ways that lead to charging the wrong people. She told him about the estate, the 3 years of embezzlement, the documentation that Eleanor had quietly assembled and distributed to the 2 people she trusted most, knowing, with the particular, a terrible clarity of someone running out of time, that she might not be there to present it herself. She told him about Dolly Hargreaves and the brooch, and the 30-year friendship, and the letter left behind. She told him about Edith Crowe, the daughter nobody knew about, the librarian who had watched from 3 miles away while her mother's second husband dismantled her mother's inheritance piece by piece. She told him about the 2 months of careful observation, the storage unit, the passport, the knowledge, arrived at too late and not late enough, that Reginald Foss was preparing to disappear. Inspector Garvey listened. He did not interrupt, which cost him something. She could see it in the occasional slight tension around his jaw, the controlled stillness of a man accustomed to directing conversations who has decided, for once, to let someone else drive. She found this admirable. "The briefcase," he said when she paused. "It contained forged documents. Our people opened it this morning. Transferred documents for 3 accounts, 2 of them linked to the Foss estate. All forged. He was moving the remaining funds before he left." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I thought it would be something of that nature. The lock had been tampered with, you see, from the outside, not the inside, which suggested someone had attempted to open it before me. Edith Crowe, I believe, on the platform at Nettleford, in the brief window before he regained consciousness. She didn't manage it, but she didn't need to. The documents were recoverable without her." Inspector Garvey turned his teacup in his hands, a small, thinking gesture that reminded Miss Marple unexpectedly of herself. "What about the conductor?" he said. "Peel, the 11-minute gap in his logbook." Miss Marple nodded. This was the part she had left for last, not because it was most important, but because it required the most care. "Mr. Peel," she said, "knew Reginald Foss was on that train, not because he was party to the embezzlement. I don't believe that for a moment, but because Foss had arranged, some weeks ago, to have the conductor's logbook show a gap, a window of unrecorded time at Nettleford, during which Foss could slip off the train without the conductor being officially required to account for his whereabouts." She paused. "Foss paid him. Not very much, I suspect. Enough. Mr. Peel is not a dishonest man by nature. He is a man who made a single dishonest decision, for what he probably told himself were reasonable reasons, and has been deeply uncomfortable about it ever since, which is why he came back through compartment C a second time to check tickets. He was nervous. Nervous people revisit things." Inspector Garvey was quiet for a moment. "So Foss arranged his own disappearance," he said slowly. "Had the conductor's cooperation for a clean exit. He planned to cross the fields at Nettleford to a waiting car, but Edith Crowe had followed him onto the platform. And he panicked," said Miss Marple. "He ran, and the steps were wet." The inspector sat back in his chair. Outside the cafe window, the little Wychwood station platform was quiet in the late afternoon light. The 4:52 not due for another 20 minutes, the platform empty, the lamp-posts beginning to glow amber against the early dusk. "Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Crowe," he said. "What do you think I should do about them?" Miss Marple looked at him with the calm, level gaze of a woman who has considered this question carefully and arrived at an answer she believes in. "I think," she said, "that you should consider what they actually did. They followed a man who had stolen from a dead woman. They confronted him. He fell. They secured him and called the police." She paused. "The estate documentation they collected constitutes, I believe, a rather compelling body of evidence for the fraud case. Without them, Reginald Foss would be on a ferry to the continent by now, with 3 forged transfer documents and a very light conscience." Inspector Garvey looked at the table, at his teacup, at the window. "No crime was technically committed," he said slowly, as though testing the shape of the sentence, "by either of them. "None that I can identify," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Can you?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for the fruitcake. Chapter 9. The Storeroom at Nettleford. Reginald Foss was in person considerably less impressive than his anxiety had suggested. Miss Marple had formed this opinion before she had even spoken to him, formed it, in fact, the moment she stepped into the small, overheated interview room at Nettleford Police Station at 4:30, and found him sitting at the table with the deflated, a slightly petulant expression of a man whose carefully constructed plan has collapsed around him, and who has not yet decided whether to be frightened or indignant. He had chosen indignant, provisionally. It was, she thought, the wrong choice. But then Reginald Foss had been making wrong choices for a considerable number of years, and one did not abandon a habit simply because it had finally produced consequences. Inspector Garvey had brought her, somewhat against his better professional judgment, and entirely because she had looked at him over the station cafe table with the patient, immovable expectation of a woman who is going to be present at this interview, whether he likes it or not. He had introduced her as a witness. This was accurate, if incomplete. Foss looked at Miss Marple with the brief, dismissive assessment of a man who has spent his professional life underestimating women of a certain age and has not yet learned anything from it. "I've told the inspector everything," he said, addressing himself primarily to Garvey. "I was attacked on that platform. A woman followed me off the train and pushed me. I want that woman charged." "Which woman?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. Foss looked at her with the slight irritation of a person who has addressed a remark to someone else and objects to being answered by a third party. "The one from the train, the mousy one, gray cardigan." "Edith Crowe," said Miss Marple, "Eleanor's daughter." The effect was immediate and unambiguous. The indignation went out of Foss's face the way air goes out of a punctured tire, rapidly, completely, leaving behind a flattened, altered shape. He looked, for just a moment, nakedly afraid. Then he reassembled himself imperfectly, with the visible effort of a man working from damaged materials. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I think you do," said Miss Marple, with the same pleasant, unhurried tone she might use to correct a mildly inaccurate statement about gardening. "Eleanor Crowe, who became Eleanor Foss, who left behind, when she died 8 months ago, a rather comprehensive record of what you had been doing to her estate for 3 years. She paused. She was a careful woman, Eleanor. Frightened, toward the end, but careful. She made certain that what she knew would not disappear with her. Foss said nothing. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were flat on the table, pressed down, as though he was trying to prevent them from doing something involuntary. "The briefcase," said Inspector Garvey, setting a clear evidence bag on the table between them. Through the plastic, the forged transfer documents were clearly visible. 3 pages of careful, professional forgery, good enough to pass casual inspection, and insufficient to survive the scrutiny they were now about to receive. "You want to tell me about these?" he told them. Not immediately, and not willingly, but with the gradual, reluctant capitulation of a man who has been playing a losing hand and has finally run out of cards to delay the reckoning. It came out in pieces, the way guilt usually does, not as a confession so much as a series of corrections, each one slightly more honest than the last, as the realization settled, layer by layer, that the documentation Edith and Dolly had assembled made denial not merely futile, but actively counterproductive. 3 years ago, he had begun diverting funds from the estate. Small amounts initially, routed through a subsidiary account he had established without Eleanor's knowledge. She had been unwell by then, intermittently, and her attention to financial matters had slipped. He had taken advantage of this, with the systematic patience of a man who tells himself that he will replace what he takes, eventually, when circumstances improve, which is the foundational lie of every embezzler who has ever existed. The circumstances had not improved. The amounts had grown. By the time Eleanor understood what was happening, had quietly, painstakingly, begun to document it. He had taken the better part of £200,000 from an estate that had been her father's life's work, and her inheritance from a man who had loved her. "She confronted you," said Miss Marple. Foss looked at the table. "Once. And you frightened her into silence." He did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was in the flat, pressed-down hands and the averted eyes, and the particular quality of his silence, not the silence of a man who denies, but the silence of a man who knows that what he did is beyond the reach of the excuses he has been making to himself, and is encountering that knowledge, perhaps for the first time, in a room with no exits. Miss Marple thought about Eleanor Foss while Foss talked, thought about her with the specific, focused attention she gave to victims, which was different from the attention she gave to suspects. Victims deserved to be understood as completely as possible, she had always believed, because understanding them was frequently the only justice available after the fact. She thought about a woman who had spent the last years of her life frightened in her own home, quietly gathering evidence with hands that trembled, distributing it to the people she trusted, making sure that the truth would outlast her own silence. It was a particular kind of courage, not the dramatic visible kind, but the sustained, invisible kind that requires getting up every morning and continuing to function while carrying something unbearable. Eleanor Foss had done that. And then she had died, and Reginald Foss had bought a ferry ticket and a storage unit, and assumed that dead women stay silent. He had been wrong about that. Inspector Garvey concluded the interview at 5:41. Reginald Foss was formally cautioned, and the fraud investigation referred to the relevant financial crimes unit, whose involvement, the inspector noted, with the careful understatement of a man who has looked at the documentation, was likely to be extensive. As Miss Marple gathered her knitting bag to leave, Foss spoke once more, not to the inspector, but to her, with the bewildered, vaguely resentful tone of a man who cannot quite account for how things went so wrong. "Who are you?" he said. "You're just some old woman on a train." Miss Marple paused at the door. She considered several responses, and discarded each of them as either too clever or too kind. "I am," she said finally, with the simple, absolute certainty of someone stating a well-established fact, "exactly what I appear to be. The difficulty, Mr. Foss, is that you never learn to look properly." She went out. Behind her, she heard Inspector Garvey make a sound that might, in a different context, have been a laugh. Chapter 10. The Last Train Home. The 15th of November arrived with the quiet, unhurried grace of a morning that has nothing to prove. The frost had gone overnight, replaced by a soft, damp warmth that was not quite rain and not quite mist, but somewhere between the two, the kind of English morning that blurs the edges of things, that makes the garden hedge and the distant church spire, and the bare elm tree all look as though they have been painted by someone working quickly, in watercolor, before the light changed. Florence's cottage sat in the middle of it, warm and lit, smelling of toast and the particular brand of baby-scented chaos that Edmund generated with impressive efficiency for someone who could not yet walk. Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table with her third cup of tea and her knitting, and felt, with the deep, undemonstrative contentment of a woman who has done what needed doing, entirely at peace. Florence came downstairs at 7:30, with Edmund on her hip and sleep still in her eyes, and found her great-aunt finishing the final rows of the pale blue cardigan with the focused satisfaction of someone completing a task that has waited long enough. "You're nearly done," Florence said, settling Edmund into his chair with the practiced one-handed efficiency of a mother 8 months into the work. "Another 20 minutes," said Miss Marple. "He'll have it before I leave." Florence put the kettle on. She moved quietly for a moment, spooning porridge into Edmund's bowl, and then said without turning around, "What will happen to them? Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Crowe?" Miss Marple finished her row, turned the knitting, and began the next. "Nothing," she said. "Inspector Garvey is a reasonable man underneath the momentum. He looked at what they actually did, and what they actually did was follow a thief, confront him, and call the police when he fell. There is no charge in that. And Mr. Peel, the conductor." "That," said Miss Marple, "is rather more complicated. He accepted money to falsify a logbook entry, which is not a nothing, but he's also a man with 23 years of clean service who made one bad decision under financial pressure and has been unable to sleep properly since." She paused. "Inspector Garvey will handle it proportionately. I believe that is the word he used." Florence set a fresh cup of tea in front of her aunt and sat down. "And Foss?" "Foss," said Miss Marple, with the calm finality of someone closing a book, "will answer for what he did, properly and in full, and in a court of law, with Eleanor's documentation placed before people whose job it is to understand exactly what it means." She looked up briefly. That was all Eleanor wanted, I think. Not revenge, just an honest accounting. Edmund, from his chair, produced a sound of emphatic agreement and threw his spoon onto the floor. She left at 10:30. Florence had offered to drive her to the station, and Miss Marple had accepted, which was a small concession to practicality that she made without excessive ceremony. There was no virtue in being difficult about lifts when lifts were offered kindly. At the cottage door, Florence hugged her, the full, genuine, slightly too tight hug of a young woman who has spent 2 days being reminded that her great-aunt is not, in fact, indestructible, and has feelings about this that she has not entirely sorted through. Miss Marple patted her back with the warm, undemonstrative affection of a woman who loves deeply and quietly, and has always found that actions communicate more reliably than words. "The cardigan is on the armchair," she said. "The left sleeve runs a fraction long, but he'll grow into it." Florence laughed despite herself. "Only you, Aunt Jane. Give him a kiss from me when he wakes up." The platform at Little Witchwood Station was quiet in the mid-morning light. The 10:52 back to St. Mary Mead Junction was not yet visible, but Miss Marple could hear it, the distant gathering sound of an approaching train, that particular combination of rhythm and weight that she had loved since childhood, and had never entirely been able to explain to anyone who did not already feel it themselves. There was something about a train, The way it arrived, with absolute certainty, regardless of what was happening on the platform. The way it carried you forward, whether you were ready or not. The way it connected one place to another, across the dark and cold of the open country. A thread of warmth and light, moving through the indifferent landscape. She thought about Edith Crowe, who had telephoned her that morning at 9, briefly and quietly, to say thank you. She had not said it elaborately. She was not an elaborate person. But the two words had carried the full weight of everything behind them, and Miss Marple had understood. She thought about Dolly Hargreaves, who had telephoned 11 minutes later, and said considerably more, at considerable volume and with considerable warmth, and had ended by inviting Miss Marple to lunch the next time she visited Florence, and had not accepted the mild deflection Miss Marple offered, but had simply talked over it, with the cheerful persistence of a woman who knows what she wants, and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Miss Marple found, to her mild surprise, that she was looking forward to it. She thought about Eleanor Foss, whose name she had not known 2 days ago, and whom she would carry with her now, the way one carries the people one has in some small and indirect way, been able to help, not in the foreground, but present. A quiet addition to the long, accumulated company of people she had known and watched and tried to understand over the course of a life spent paying attention. There were so many of them by now. The village had given her all of them. St. Mary Mead, with its ordinary streets, and its ordinary people, and its perfectly extraordinary capacity for human darkness and human courage, had been her education in everything that mattered. Every case, every mystery, every person who had sat across from her on a train, or at a tea table, or in a garden, and revealed, in some small unconscious way, the truth of themselves. All of them had been, in some sense, her teachers. She was grateful for every one. The 10:52 arrived at 10:51, which was, she thought, a good omen. She found a compartment, second carriage, window seat facing forward, and settled herself with her knitting bag on the seat beside her and her handbag on her lap. The carriage was nearly empty at this hour. A young mother with a sleeping infant in a pram tucked against the far wall. An elderly man with a crossword, pencil moving in confident, unhurried strokes. Perfectly ordinary, perfectly unremarkable. Miss Marple looked around the compartment with the mild, unfocused gaze of a woman thinking about nothing in particular, and felt the familiar, quiet readiness settle over her, the particular alertness of a person who has learned over a very long life that ordinary things are never only ordinary, that every compartment contains its stories, that the truth, always, is somewhere in the room. The train moved. Outside the window, little Witchwood slid gently away. The station, the platform lamp-posts, the high street beyond the fence, the church spire above the bare trees. Then the village was gone, and there was only the countryside, wide and gray and patient, running past in the soft November light. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. She had started a new project, a small hat, pale green, for Edmund, who would need one before winter was properly over. The wool was soft, and the pattern was simple, and her hands moved through it with the ease of long practice, the needles clicking their quiet, steady rhythm against the sound of the wheels on the track. The 10:52 gathered speed. Ahead, somewhere in the gray English distance, St. Mary Mead was waiting, her cat, her garden, her village with all its small and inexhaustible dramas. The postmistress would have opinions about something. The vicar's wife would be organizing another fete. Someone, somewhere, would be doing something they ought not to be doing, and leaving behind, in the process, the small, inevitable, entirely human evidence of it. And Miss Jane Marple would be there, knitting, noticing, remembering, patient as the countryside itself, and considerably more dangerous than she looked. Outside, the last of Little Witchwood vanished into the middle distance. The train ran on. The vanishing passenger, a Miss Marple mystery, outro. There is a particular kind of justice that never makes the newspapers. It does not arrive with handcuffs or courtroom drama or the satisfying finality of a gavel coming down. It arrives quietly, over tea, in a small cafe, on a cold November platform, in the moment when the truth, which has been patient for a very long time, finally stops waiting and simply makes itself known. Reginald Foss had believed, as so many do, that the dead stay silent, that grief exhausts people, that a frightened woman's careful documentation passed between two pairs of ordinary hands would dissolve somewhere between sorrow and the practical business of continuing to live. He had not accounted for friendship, for a brooch pressed into a widow's hands, for a daughter who drove 3 miles every Sunday past the house where her mother had been afraid, who carried that fear in her chest like a stone, and who had decided, quietly, without heroism, simply because someone had to, that it was time to put it down. He had not accounted for an old woman with a knitting bag and a pot of blackberry jam who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Miss Marple never sought credit. She never wanted it. She would return to St. Mary Mead, to Ptolemy and her garden, and the gentle, inexhaustible theater of village life, and she would tell no one about Edith Crowe or Eleanor Foss or the 7:15, except perhaps in the way she always did, sideways, in reference to someone else, as a quiet illustration of something she had always known. That ordinary people, in ordinary places, are capable of extraordinary courage, and that evil, however well-dressed and well-planned, always leaves something behind. It left a glove this time. That was enough.